How
was
does my audio sound now?
much better.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Now I cleaned it up.
Wait, no, it
Um,
sounds like no. Actually, never mind. It sounds like a squirrel voice almost.
That's Noah's real voice. He's using the one mic that actually shows his real voice right now. I have to edit this when we do blowback. He sounds about
Wait,
1 octave higher.
Yeah, it sounds like
hold on.
you
Come
sound like
on.
you sound squeaky.
I think you sound younger and more sort of full of life to me.
All right,
You
what about
sound like
this?
you sound like you're about to do a Young Americans for Freedom debate on a college campus.
Noah, can you say that's a fallacy real quick? Just to test
That's
the...
a fallacy.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh, that tracks. You got the
Well,
actually
give
voice.
us your give us your
now you
slightly
now you get
pitched...
the good microphone again.
Okay, great. But no, yeah, it was 1961, right? There was a series of uprisings, and this is the last point I'll make, and I'll shut up for a sec. But in which the indigenous population of Angola, this is not even to go into other uprisings at the time, they rose up against the Portuguese colonial authorities and the settlers, the white settlers from Portugal, and it was brutal. They killed men, women, and children. It was indiscriminate. They even killed some fellow Angolans. It was chaotic, but it was really one of many, many cases that you can find in a history of resistance to a colonial authority, which is not always something that you would personally want to be on one or the other side of yourself from the comfort of your own home. And I think that when it comes to the Israel conversation right now, there really has been this effort to turn October 7th, which we still hear is the justification for every single thing inflicted on Gaza and the West Bank. We still hear it as if it's this unique moment, this unique day in history, something that has never, ever happened before, ever. And I think, not that we haven't covered stuff like this before, but I think in the earlier episodes of this season, you'll hear exactly this kind of thing happening in a colony ruled by the Portuguese. And it's really not a mystery. And it's really not that unique. It's what happens. And similarly, at some point, the Portuguese empire that was ruling over the Angolans fell apart and packed up and went home. So there's a lot of echoes in this season all over the place.
I would say the one echo that I sort of think about a lot is one that Vincent Bevins, the journalist, put on Twitter that is really, really, really interesting, which is about how, South Africa also was the state that pursued in the years before it finally went away, that it pursued aggressive wars against Angola, Zambia, Botswana, not just against these like nations as their governments, but you had South African forces, cooking shit up in all those countries, Mozambique and so forth. And it did all this not because it actually conformed to a real, an actual set of strategic threats to South Africa. Although perhaps from Angola there may have eventually been something like that, but really it was because of paranoia. It was because South Africa was paranoid and fearful, and that paranoia and fear made them launch all of these offensive operations, which ultimately stretched their military very thin and made it very difficult for South Africa to remain viable as a threatening, as the kind of a dominant military force in Southern Africa that it had been. And so when people ask the question of well, then how did this powerful state and system ultimately collapse? It was a consequence of decisions that they had made, that they had committed to, the offensive operations they'd committed to out of this paranoia and fear of living on a continent with black ruled governments as well.
Yeah. So a question for you guys, actually, and I don't know if this is pertinent to this season, but one thing that I was reading on was the efforts in the apartheid government in trying to find formal recognition and international recognition for the Bantustan structures that they had developed. And since we are, I don't know if you guys cover that at all or have looked into that at all, but something that I see that is similar to that in modern day, of course, is the now official recognition of Palestinian statehoods that are coming down from all of our Western allies. It's the last, holdouts basically around the world that haven't offered formal recognition to a Palestinian state, and this, of course, has been met with a tremendous discontent from the Israeli state, in spite of the reality that it seems like this would be beneficial for them in order to continue some kind of demographic majority, ethno supremacist, ethno state project that they want to without further incursions from the international community. So, do you guys think that this is just simply another instance of Israel, for example, getting frustrated because they're incredibly entitled and incredibly arrogant? Or do you feel like the South African assessment at the time was also an incorrect one, and that it wasn't good to even offer offer recognition by the international community to the Bantustans?
I'm gonna let you take that one, Noah.
Sure. I think one of the things that the context that's sort of important and relevant with Israel and diplomatic recognition in Palestine is that there was this process called Oslo in the 1990s specifically, where the Palestinians made a specific strategic concession to recognize the Israeli government with the expectation, misguided, that they would be able to negotiate in good faith with the Israelis through a U.S. mediated process. This is what the Oslo Accords set in motion, and it obviously failed.
Yeah.
And so the diplomatic recognition stuff is to me it's kind of like a revival of these 1990s ideals that don't really work right now. And it's a fig leaf for governments to just literally do anything but say we're not going to send arms, we're not going to have any military support. I mean, the United Kingdom's talking about recognizing Palestine, and they're we see the plain data about how they assist Israeli operations and so forth. I think in the case of South Africa, recognition of Bantustan territory, what comes up in the literature is not so much, again, that there was this ask for diplomatic recognition that could have ever been that effective, but it was more that there was this ongoing civil rights struggle within a country, and that the principle of equality among the people within that country was the call. And in the 1980s, when the international sanctions movement picked up steam, it became a lot easier for the, again, that principle of, I don't want to say one man, one vote, because it's a specific thing, but that principle of equal rights for everybody in the same land was pretty easily demanded, and easy to understand and articulate and repackage, as opposed to having to go through some territory to say well, what if we gave the people in the Bantustans more right, and so on.
Oh no, that's exactly what I was thinking as well, which is that it actually, from a legal standpoint, if there's additional international pressure, creates tremendous setbacks for a singular solitary state. If because it's much easier to make this demand in an apartheid structure where the full-blown sovereignty is in the hands of the Israeli state, as opposed to a two-state Bantustan structure that Israel seemingly is opposing quite vociferously. So I guess the question was do you feel as though this is a own goal in the long run for Israel? This idea that they want to complete their ethnic cleansing campaign, and therefore they're so busy with that they don't even understand that this is actually a fig leaf offered to them by Western governments that would, at the very least, complicate any sort of demand for one state with equal representation for all Palestinians living under Israeli sovereignty.
This is what I was talking about with the paranoia and fear in South Africa that motivated them. Is that Israel psychologically, in terms of the outlook that is part of how they're determining their strategy at this moment, is also driven by this paranoia and fear. And the fig leaf that they're being offered, because they are so paranoid about what any empowerment, even the softest, most pillowy, slightest empowerment of any Palestinian political presence anywhere means for them. Like the paranoia makes them overly conscious of these things and unable to recognize, like a gift horse in the mouth when it shows up. Or they don't see what's in front of them. They don't see that this is actually like the Keir Starmer and Macron and all of them are like essentially offering them a way out. Because again, like and this is similar to apartheid South Africa in the final years of its life. The Israeli attitude is that anything that rewards political Palestinians for anything, and that's how they view it. They view this as like Palestinians get a reward. We're rewarding them for October 7th by recognizing this. They view that as just like an incitement of more terrorism, which is, when you get down to it, like if you're watching news broadcasts or radio broadcasts from the apartheid era, that's when like the surreality of how similar it sounds starts to come in, because that's what the South African government said. They just call them all terrorists. The ANC is a terrorist organization. Mandela is a terrorist. Terrorist. Have you heard that they're terrorists, by the way? It's not a novel playbook to like latch onto that stuff and reject all diplomacy.
One question.
we spoke about
go
this.
Ahead.
Oh,
Sorry,
sorry.
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say last year when we came on to talk about our previous season on Cambodia,
Yeah.
we also spoke a lot about what was going on at that point. I think Lebanon was on the menu. Israelis hadn't gone in yet, but they were just announcing it basically, and that had certain parallels to Indochina. But I remember at that point our conversation was about how, not to put things in simplistic terms, but at this point, I won't say that there aren't calculations and strategies and high-level discussions, that are guiding some kind of overall policy, and that it's just pure id. But in terms of international geopolitics and strategy, Israel has become something of a problem dog. I mean, it's rabid. And what we discussed last year was that is no longer even advantageous to many of the hardcore's fellow Zionists who want to simply manage an occupation and manage an exploitation and humiliation of Palestinians forever. This is, while it's a horrifying cost, it is going to probably speed up Israel's own crack up, which, of course, we've discussed many times. And South Africa was rather more accommodating, I have to say, if for the very fact that we saw there were eventually reforms that phased the system of apartheid out.
One thing that Noam Chomsky has brought up
Mandela.
when making this comparison always is that he has routinely brought up the fact that the South African apartheid structure actually relied on the black population, the native population, for cheap labor, as opposed to Israel, that has made it clear that they would make up for the lack of cheap labor by bringing in foreign workers instead, having their own, I guess, like kafala system, not dissimilar to what you see in other Gulf nation states. And therefore they have no use for the indigenous population whatsoever, and that they are simply an aberration that must be excised. So from that perspective, it does seem like the apartheid structure in South Africa also had to coexist to a certain degree in this unjust two-tier system.
Great point. I want to stay far away from left sectarian politics as I possibly can in my life, as well as this broadcast. But there was a kind of reaction sometimes from, maybe old school lefties who wanted to talk always in terms of kind of surplus labor population being exploited by the colonizer or whatever, that didn't totally line up with what's going on in Israel and Palestine. And I think that is, as you perfectly laid out there, on full display. And it lines up way more with South Africa. This was a place where the white government wanted everything to remain more or less contiguous. Israel is operating on I think of a different logic, a logic of a different category. And it is a genocidal logic, which, as much as you can say, and maybe should history have turned out differently, South Africa would have gotten somewhere closer to where Israel is now, if not exactly where it is now. That is not how it turned out. And so you have to know where the similarities begin and end. But I agree, and I think that when I was there, however many years ago, this was a conversation at the time. You would just see that Israel really had no intention of even amalgamating its occupied populations into being a part of its economic engine in the way that they could just import labor and exploit labor. Foreigners. So yeah, it is a categorical difference. I would agree with you.
Yeah, there's one other aspect of this story that I want to hear your perspective on, and that is, of course, the Cuban intervention. Now, one thing that I've thought about quite a bit was how different these anti-colonial resistance movements historically have been in places, specifically in Africa. And I think one of the most important factors there was not only that this was happening at the peak of the Cold War, so there was a different pole that a different world power that these countries could potentially rely on, if not to simply leverage against the United States of America. But also outside of that, there was direct military intervention coming from this opposite bloc, right? And the Cuban intervention was quite significant. So one of the questions I have is, in the absence of that, what are the is there anything even remotely similar in with respect to other regional actors and their involvement with Israel, and how that has played a role in this, how that has played a role in Israel continuing its genocide unabated and with full-blown Western support?
I will say that I think something that Israel, makes the Cuban intervention really special is that, and this is something a guest that we've interviewed has said, the historian Piero Glahesis, which is that the Cuban intervention is a unique example. There hasn't in modern history been an example of a poor country that is how to put it, there's never been a poor country that on the basis of an ideological commitment went to the aid militarily of another poor country, without being directly threatened itself. And I think that there is a real, there's not an easy example that comes to mind for how Israel might be restrained in the way that South Africa was thwarted at the time of the intervention, in part because the Cuban example was really that unique.
I guess Yemen would be the only comparison, and yet there is no direct intervention beyond blockades and maybe lobbing a couple missiles in Israel's direction every now and then.
I was about to say Yemen. I mean, it's what Yemen is doing, but Yemen, Cuba was a poor country. It was a country that itself was very reliant on the Eastern Bloc and direct aid. The Union. These are networks and alliances that just don't quite have exact analogies these days. But Cuba was still a pretty robust state in terms of its military experience, the military experience of its population, the strategy for actually working with fellow progressive and revolutionary states. One of the reasons why Cuba felt like things might be possible in working with Angola in Africa was because it was a hell of a lot less risky than incurring the wrath of the United States in Latin America. Because at that point, several attempts at sort of spreading a militant version of revolution in Latin America had simply fizzled out, more or less. And the Americans weren't getting any friendlier to Cuba because of those attempts. So when you saw this invasion by South Africa happening toward a friendly state in Angola, which had had dealings with Cuba in the past, Cuba said, hey, look, we have a good military for a small socialist country. We have the know-how. We know how guerrilla war works. Let's go help. There, as Piero Glahesis, really just the top-notch historian on this issue that we were fortunate enough to have extensive conversations with, 2 whole bonus episodes with, and he's in the main series. He, in his opinion, which I find persuasive, it is a pretty much the pure case of revolutionary idealism in the case of Cuba. I mean, there was a pragmatic reason why they could operate in Africa as opposed to Latin America, but they had muscle in a way that Yemen, while admirable, doesn't have the same amount of muscle to
Yeah.
actually send tens of thousands of troops. And that made all the difference. I mean, they saved Angola from a South African invasion, not just a South African invasion, but also the fellow nationalists that were opposed to the MPLA, backed by Mobutu, not to mention foreign mercenaries and the CIA. There's really no analog to it. And it cost Cuba a lot. Cuba did not get some diamond contract that was a big payday for them. They did not get some kind of, exploitative rights or mining rights with Angola. And that is not to say that the two countries are on the same footing that they were way back. I think that they've drifted a bit, probably geopolitically. Angola is now looking to be a power player in Africa, or like a place where other countries can take their disputes, and it can be a sort of middleman. It's trying to balance, like many countries are, the contest between China and the U.S. But in that period, Cuba's efforts were, I would say, unprecedented and remain unique.
Yeah. No, but it was, the question, I guess, is like, was it pivotal in terms of ensuring that there wasn't additional support from South Africa in this, like in the development of the modern Angola that we know?
It was absolutely pivotal, and not only the kind of canned history, even on the left, is that the Cubans went, or in some left-wing version of this, you could say, is the Cubans went in and the Soviets didn't want them to, and it was like, not only are the Cubans not the Soviets' puppet, the Soviets were cynical and unmoved, and the Cubans were the real socialists. I mean, you could put it that way, I suppose, because Cuba didn't ask for permission from the Soviet Union, which, sort of knocks down the argument that they were a proxy of Moscow. However, the Soviets did, after maybe expressing a little bit of frustration that Cuba didn't even give them a heads up, they did immediately, having already recognized the MPLA, government in Angola, the progressive government, they supplied weapons, advisors, pretty much everything they could do short of their own military involvement, which they thought would be needlessly provocative, especially since the Cubans had already jumped in. So yes, not only did the Cubans themselves move the needle, they persuaded the Soviet Union, which was obviously a far more powerful resource for both Cuba and Angola, to come in as well. And that really tipped the scales. I mean, Angola was getting billions of dollars when all was said and done in today's money, thanks to the efforts of the Cubans and the Soviets together, not to mention weapons. And it was absolutely pivotal. I don't think anyone would really argue Angola had a chance if the Cubans and then moreover the Soviets hadn't gotten involved in stopping this.
Noah, are you going to say something?
Yeah, no, I'm just worried about my mic.
It's all good. Don't worry about it. It is what it is.
No, the only thing I would really add to what Brennan said there, I mean, it's because I do think it was a pretty good and comprehensive summary, is that all of the parties who are, like the Cuban role in Aquito Cuanavale and of stopping, which is the decisive battle in the fight against South Africa. The Cuban role, a lot of people that we've spoken to, at least that I spoke to, interviewing Piero Glahesis and another, an Ethiopian American filmmaker, Nagash Abdurrahman, who made a short film about Cuba and Africa. And they feel that Cuba's role is not adequately played up. And I think that there is a really, that there's like an important case to be made that, if anything, like Cuba's, the decisive role of Cuba's intervention has been underplayed. And I would add one other thing, which is that the sort of ultimate part of what made Cuba's decisive action or what makes it stand out in relief was, to emphasize something Brendan said, was that it was against the advice of the Soviets. It was against the advice of the benefactor in the Eastern Bloc. It was against, what a lot of realpolitik would have advocated at that time. It was a sense, it was a feeling, it was an impression that apartheid was vulnerable. And then at the right moment in the late 80s, it was the Cubans who had the initiative to say, no, we need to strike now, and we can achieve something here.
I've seen a couple chatters, and he's saying the Cubans were unwelcome in Angola, and that someone said Che wrote that in his diary. Okay, Che was long dead by this point. You're talking about the 1960s, which was an earlier era of cooperation between Cuba and Angola, which was, moderately successful, although not completely. This was 1975. Che was not around. It's a totally different world event, and the Cubans were invited. In fact, the Angolan government begged them to come, and then begged them to stay once they were there. There was decades of cooperation, even after Agostinho Neto died. I don't know if you know who that is, but that's who was in charge when they were there. Even after he died, the Cubans said, we will not leave. We will not bring home one soldier until you are completely comfortable with the threat from South Africa. And this is important to note. They were not there to necessarily fight the war against Savimbi and the rival nationalists to the MPLA, the rival Angolans. The Cubans were always saying, that is something you're going to have to take care of whether we're here or not. We are here to guarantee your safety against South Africa, an external threat. And there were actually different military debates, and at times it got pretty hostile between the Cubans and the Soviets, and what strategy they should be pursuing against the enemies of Angola. But the Cubans kept their word and only left once they had performed a pretty impressive military comeback in, as Noah mentioned, the township of Cuito Cuanavale, which was not only a turning point in the war in Angola, but as Nelson Mandela put it, a turning point in southern Africa, if not, the world, because a white supremacist army had been defeated by a collaboration between Soviets, Cubans, and native Angolans. And they were driven out, and it meant that the negotiating table was suddenly far more a far more welcome place for the Angolans and the Cubans. And that's how Angola was kicked out, which, by the way, also resulted in the independence of Namibia, which is a country that in our season, but it plays a big role in what happens in Angola, because South Africa is basically using Angola as a way to control Namibia, or a way to retain control over Namibia. And so it was military strength. I think it really must be stressed. It was military resistance that created the opportunities at the negotiating table. And the Angolan government was insistent that the Cubans stay for decades. And this we will outline for you if you listen to our season. It's very clear in the records.
To add more into the conversation about Cuba acting independently of the USSR's directive, it seems to me like the Americans also thought that this was done at the behest of the USSR and went directly to the USSR to intervene. And they were positively flummoxed by the fact that it was outside of their control, that the armed intervention was unexpected, and also independent of the USSR's goals.
Yes, and it's worth emphasizing there that this is a much larger this was how the U.S. understood Cuba throughout the Cold War. The U.S. repeatedly misunderstood how people in the U.S. consistently thought that Cuba just takes direction from the Soviet Union. Fidel is this authoritarian strongman. They don't have an independent set of ideas about how they want to engage the world. And so whenever we see Cubans show up somewhere, it's Soviet communism, putting its tentacles around some poor country. And as a result, it meant that, it was really not until the late 1980s, when the Cubans had started to have some real military victories in Angola under their belt, that the U.S. began negotiating with them, at the table like adults. And I think that there is a real, it's I think, a really sort of kind of telling failure of American policy, but also like we didn't want to negotiate with the Cubans, and we've never wanted to negotiate with Cubans. We want to destroy the Cuban government, and so it's always a lot easier when like that's your position is this sort of almost like posture of total annihilation. Then, well, like why would you bother caring what they think? Why would you bother talking to them? Because it was not just in one administration that the Americans went to Moscow and said, "Hey, can you get Fidel to back off?" And then Moscow says, "We don't control him. They're our allies. We support them, but we don't control him." And the Americans didn't get that because, by the way, maybe that says something about how we view our allies. Especially these days, in terms of what alliance means and whether it really just means doing what the U.S. tells you.
Yeah, it's interesting because like some conversations were taking place where America was also trying to make it seem as though they were not as involved with the South African government, despite offering material support to the South African government, and made it seem as though they were an independent entity acting out on their own desires, which I guess there is some truth to. Do you feel like the American involvement there was simply giving as much control to South Africa as possible in the region in an effort not to let this resource-rich region fall into the hands of the Soviets, or do you think there was more interest beyond that?
I think that there was interest in, American access to the markets like diamonds and oil. One really key thing we should mention here that's actually kind of a big paradox for anyone who's a little bit too dug into, one ideological side or the
Get
other
ready
in the
for your
Cold War
dogmas to be broken.
yeah, sorry, I'm not trying to over egg the pudding here. I'm just trying to sell the show.
Get ready to be
Is that is that during this entire conflict, Cuban soldiers were guarding an oil refinery in the north of Angola for the socialist government that was run by the American firm Gulf Oil. And it was the pro South African American backed rebels that were attacking Gulf Oil on behalf of Savimbi. So this is where things, you got to kind of step into the real world a little bit and things get a little messy because there were American interests in both directions. Gulf Oil just wanted to work with whatever the government of Angola happened to be. And the Angolan government was fine with that. They were a developing country. They had oil. They wanted to sell it. Gulf Oil was as good a customer as any, or as good as a partner as any. Then you had the, ideological arm of the American state working to sabotage that kind of relationship. So I think that there is a complicated relationship between America and the desire for control and exploitation of Angola. Oscar Ramos Oliva talked to me a bit about this as well. But the Europeans definitely were interested in those diamonds and in that oil. And of course, South Africa, if it had its day, wanted probably not a white government in Angola because that was just so far from the ingredients they had at their disposal, but probably a friendly government by a black nationalist organization that would, cut them into Angola's resources. And so when it comes to America, I think that it absolutely was partially a anti-Soviet measure. I think it was partially a commercial and imperial, grubby measure. And then it just sort of, we also must remember post-war.
That was
and
what I was
post-Church
going to
Committee.
emphasize.
Yeah, Noah, feel free to take it away.
Yeah, the thing with like 75 and when the US, because essentially the US starts supporting Savimbi and UNITA and the other and a third resistance movement that later kind of falls off called the FNLA, but they end up getting involved in Angola
in a big way in 1975 when it's starting to look like, oh shit, the like Angolans, like Angola is going to be it's the Portuguese Empire is over, and the group poised to take control of Luanda is Marxist. Oh fuck, this is bad, and oh, this is really bad. And not only is it really bad in a vacuum when communism wins anywhere or threatens to, it's also really bad when it's happening right at the end of the Vietnam War. And it's happening at the moment of like the greatest American humiliation since, who could say when. And Cambodia has fallen to the Khmer Rouge at this time. And even though America will later be friends with the Khmer Rouge, that's in the future. And so the US sees Angola, and Henry Kissinger sees Angola, and they see a battlefield. They see an opportunity to, fight what they view as like Soviet influence, but more than anything, to bog them down, to show, to demonstrate that what America really cares about is the show of force. And so a lot of what America begins Americans' involvement is wanting to show that even after Vietnam, we can still fight communists, even if there's no good reason for it. And moreover, that like kind of cynical basis for the policy, ends up being something that persists from the Ford years into the Carter years, and then in the Reagan years it becomes a little less cynical and just openly crazy, or at least like enthusiastically bloodthirsty, however you want to put it. But it does begin with this very specific set of political circumstances at the end of the Vietnam War, and as Brendan was getting to say, post Watergate, where there was a very real kind of delicacy to how will the U.S. be able to do covert ops at the one time during the Cold War when there was real domestic political pressure in the mid 70s to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't be doing this all the time. Maybe this is a bad idea. Maybe this is destroying our soul. Maybe we shouldn't be. Maybe in Angola, when and the revelation of American involvement in Angola also produced that kind of scandal as well. So it has a kind of, it's not just like, oh, this was a battleground that Congress and everybody said, oh, we're fighting there now. It began. It has controversial origins, and the cynicism that was our basis there, not with any real plan or anything. It endures for 15 years of a pointless civil war.
One last question that I have for you guys, and I feel like the last season also was highlighting China's L's here, but how much do you guys, I mean, I'm assuming you talk a bit about Chinese involvement here as well, and their personal ambitions at a time when I guess at this point they too also represent like a different force than the USSR in the global stage. And they have their own personal interests in all of these regions, including Angola. What do you think about the everyone is hitting the dang, or no, not the dang, that's the Xi Jinping one, the social credit meme in the chat going, cut it out. But how does Chinese involvement look like in Angola?
Actually,
China support. Sorry, go ahead, Noah.
there was just a quick way of sort of getting it. Brennan can go into a bit more of like some of the earlier history of it, but something that I didn't want to lose is that at this particular moment, part of like what has defined China's approach in Africa is not like obviously the scare headlines about debt traps and stuff like that, but it's China wants to do deal making. They have a lot of manufacturing capacity and development infrastructure, Belt and Road and all that, and they want to bring it to Southern Africa and so forth. And that's their interest. They want to cut deals, and that's they're not. It's not. There's not like a grander, more nefarious set of circumstances to it that Americans put in there. But that sort of approach is, I think, also sort of been reflected. Like it's not a novel way that like since the 1990s, essentially, since the Cold War ended, the ideological stakes of this conflict, even though, as Brennan will say, like China did get involved with apartheid South Africa and UNITA before that period happened. But to give an example of not just China, but to bring back Israel for a second, Israel was obviously this huge ally of apartheid South Africa in the 80s and in the decade prior. But in the 1990s, when diamond mines went back into control of the government, and Israel is a major diamond trader, particularly at that
Oh, yeah.
time, it became
Yeah.
way more advantageous for Israel to work with the MPLA, to work with the former Marxists in control of Angola. And I think that it's helpful for people to think perhaps of like not just this region of the world, but the post Cold War reality for a lot of third world countries as being about figuring out like who are my business partners, who can I work with to develop, to make money, to encourage economic growth and things like that. As opposed to thinking about it in terms of these ideological, moral, philosophical stakes that are guiding people's decision making. And I thought that like the example of how China is sort of, that was their approach now, but then also how Israel seemed to have been on both sides of the 90s is a good reflection of that, or at least something that made me think about that reality as we were researching and writing this season. And so it was just a bit front of brain. Sorry to have cut in front of you there, Brendan.
The discussion of China at the time of our story, which is in the 70s and the 80s,
Yeah.
and China now, because we've entered a completely different era and a completely different leadership and philosophy of development and international relations for China. What I would say is, as far as China then, having somewhat recently, come off of the Sino-Soviet split, China backed the same people as the United States.
Yeah.
They backed Savimbi. They backed Holden Roberto, who was related through marriage or some in-law relationship with Mobutu. And much like they did in Afghanistan, they were there for anyone who was fighting the USSR, not to oversimplify it, but certainly in this case. And that was simply the strategy at the time. China was, I think it's fairly easy to argue, more antagonistic to the USSR at this point than to the United States. You only have to look at the common interests and or common clients that both China and the United States backed, Savimbi being one of them. In fact, China caught flack for not speaking out against the coalition that included apartheid South Africa during this moment, whereas the USSR was always opposed and stood with the Cubans and the rest of the Eastern Bloc. We should also say the Soviet Union and the Cubans. East Germany was very helpful to the Angolans and supplied a lot of materiel.
Czechoslovakia as well.
Czechoslovakia was the earliest, I think the earliest arms transfers from the Eastern Bloc came from Czechoslovakia. So that's where China was back then. We don't focus a ton on it this season because they're not driving the action, but they did pick that side. When it comes to now, okay, sorry, do you want to add to that the first?
Yeah,
part
just
of the
to say
timeline
that they did back away. They did eventually leave to like Chinese support was not like a permanent fixture of the entire time of UNITA's civil war. There was, I think, a point in like the late 70s or the very early 80s when China also said like we're like our playing this angle of it is done.
Do you feel like this was a byproduct of like America's or specifically Kissinger's involvement with China as well, where like you have the Sino-Soviet split on the one hand, and then on the other hand there are gains being made for China as like official recognition, as opposed to the ROC, the People's Republic of China gaining official recognition and legitimacy in the global stage, and then a developing China wanting to be a global player instead of consistently going against the United States of America is like playing ball to some degree as another alternative force of I guess like some developing socialism that isn't the USSR.
Yeah, I just want to shout out Reginald Vell Johnson here. That little book, Stasi State or Socialist Paradise, that is a good book. If people want to check that out, it's a nice primer on East Germany, just because East Germany does play a role here in Angola. But yeah, Hassan, with China, I would say, I mean, this is where I should plug our fifth season because we really dive into what happened there in the fifth season. It was in very many ways connected with the question of Vietnam, Cambodia, not to mention tons of other things, of course. But China felt as though we could go into so many things with the Sino-Soviet split, but that essentially China had more to gain from its own development, from its own standing in the world, by standing apart from the USSR. I'm sure the lead of many in the Chinese leadership not playing second fiddle to the USSR as the other, largest communist country on earth. It felt it had more to gain from a partnership or a tacit partnership with the United States, and that's certainly how they operated for several decades.
I mean, it was
Then the
successful.
USSR,
It-
it was successful, and I
for
I
Chinese
think it made
interests.
sense. You could argue it's ideological or moral or whatever points, but it was successful. I think, look, China's still here. The Soviet Union isn't.
Yeah.
So
And
there's
not
a
only
lot
is
to
it
go
still
into.
here,
I'm
but
sure.
it was able to make domestic interventions without, or it was able to make domestic decisions in terms of developing a centrally planned economy, while still simultaneously having a flow of foreign capital come into the country without American intervention and American demands that have existed in other places. I feel like it gave itself leverage in the global stage that allowed Chinese development to take place in the way that it did without as much foreign interference.
No doubt, and that was one of the reasons Gorbachev and the kind of new thinking, it was called, in the Soviet Union in the mid '80s. Really, that's when the Soviet support to the third world began to completely dry up. Castro had a big problem with this when he met with Gorbachev. He was not, he was a huge recipient. Cuba was a huge recipient of that support. So was Afghanistan. So was the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Gorbachev, again, historical figure of great importance, whether you think something's bad. It was a blow to the Soviet network of fellow socialist regimes, not just the Eastern Bloc, but communism worldwide, for him to have said, we got to focus on the domestic side of things and stop cutting checks to everybody all over the world who want to fight the Americans and support us. What I would say is that they attempted the same thing in the Soviet Union that China did. Maybe it was too little too late, day late and a dollar short. I don't know. And the Soviet Union still collapsed. But any way you slice it, you have to fast forward a little bit to talk about China today, which is, of course, many, many decades after the events of this season we're covering. But we do talk about it in our final episode. And I'll just say that to echo Noah a little bit, the contest between China and America at this moment in Africa, there's a ton of propaganda around it. I know the Western propaganda around it more than I know the other side, perhaps. But most scholarship that I find persuasive disputes heavily the idea of debt trap diplomacy and some kind of neo-colonial project of China to do what the European empires did to Africa back in the day, or what America did in a more limited way in the 20th century. And so I think there's a very different approach. It's not to put on total glasses. These scholars we cite say it's case by case. One day a Chinese oil firm is operating without a permit. The next day, a Chinese construction in a totally different part of Africa is helping to rebuild in a way that is essential, in a way that the West is not helping out. So you have to really kind of get into the weeds about it. But it is a very, very different relationship that China has now than it did in the 1970s, specifically toward Angola, that we cover in this season.
And the one last thing I would touch on that with is that a lot of the story of this season involves countries who are very actively seeking better relations with the United States. Cuba is sort of always and kind of is always trying that and always wants it, but is in the doomed position of abiding by in the case of Angola, a moral code that makes that kind of peace more difficult to achieve. But these other countries, like Angola, for example, they want to join the IMF, for at different points in years. They want to be plugged into the world. They want to